Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Blight, Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition. Welcome back. Another in our GLC at Lunch talks. This week, we're very proud to host Amanda Gibson, who is our full semester fellow. Been delighted to have her here. She's going to show us that we do all kinds of history here, all kinds of pursuits of knowledge. And here we have an economic historian, my friends, a serious economic historian studying slavery from its underside in not just the world of banking, but the world of subscription schemes conducted by African-American slaves themselves while enslaved. If you think you've experienced new perspectives and new angles on this slavery experience, here's another one. Amanda did her PhD at William and Mary. She has undergraduate degrees from the PhD in American history. She has undergraduate degrees from the University of Delaware in both history and economics. She's also currently a postdoc fellow at Kenyon College in Ohio. And she's preparing a book for publication called Credit is Due. I've had a number of conversations, great conversations with Amanda about this subject. We've had other fellows here at the center in the past who have done various aspects of the economics on the ground of slavery, including the idea of how slave owners at times took out mortgages on their slaves. Here we see the perspective of the enslaved themselves and how they schemed, found ways to organize and cope, and even to raise resources, money, on their own. Welcome everybody today. We've got a great audience out there. We welcome your questions. Put them down in the Q&A, and after Amanda's talk, we'll take them up. So Amanda, welcome, and it's turned over to you.
All right. Thank you, David, for that introduction. Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint up here. All right. And you all can see that? Okay, hope so. So yes, thank you, David, for that introduction. I also wanted to thank the GLC for hosting me this semester. My time at Yale has already been very productive. Finally, before I get started, I want to thank the participants for taking the time to tune into my talk. So let's get into it. So in the talk and in the book that I'm working on, I explore debt relationships in the Upper South and present a new perspective on our understanding of the importance of race to the development of the commercial banking system, like David said. Ultimately, in my book, I argue that the institutionalization and nationalization of the commercial banking system marginalized the creative and productive financial arrangements that were practiced by Black and white Americans in the antebellum period. So to situate us chronologically and geographically, my work focuses on the Upper South, from about the American Revolution to the Civil War. So this is an 1860 Coast Guard map of the South. It shows the distribution of the enslaved population. And so the area circled in red is where I focus. During this time period, from the American Revolution to the Civil War, banking itself went from non-existent to the 1860s, only about 80 years later, where we have a robust, institutionalized, systemic banking sector, with many of the aspects of our modern banking system already in place. I focus on Virginia, and I did in the dissertation, because unlike the quickly developing banking centers in the Northeast, Virginia was a slave society, as you can see on the map, and I'm primarily interested in race. Virginia is also a nexus point for the Southern agricultural economy in the period. It serves as a jumping off point for ambitious white Southerners who established plantations in Tennessee and Mississippi. You can see where the distribution of enslaved people is farther in the South. They take with them their ideas about how to organize an economy, who gets to participate in that economy and how. This stream of humanity south and west in the antebellum period also includes the forced migration of enslaved people, many of whom depart from Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the state and one of the two main urban centers for the domestic slave trade. So enslaved people, like their enslavers, took their own ideas about freedom and community and their own economic practices west. So my research relies on three historiographical traditions. First, more traditional histories of banking examine the evolution of banks as we know them. So these are institutions that act as financial intermediaries. They take in capital in multiple changing forms over the chronology of my research and lend that money back out with the goal of making a profit. These works have provided us with a careful analysis of how the institutions and legal structures of the banking system evolved over time. However, they offer little on the importance of race to the rise of the banking system. So for that, I look at new histories of capitalism, which ask us to follow the money and demonstrate the close connection between enslavement and the development of American finance. They argue that enslavement was capitalistic and that the racialization and subjugation of Africans and people of African descent provided capital which flowed through the banking system and served as the foundation for our economic system today. This is incredibly important work to show the racial origins of American capitalism, but I think it still misses part of the story. In the new history of capitalism, enslaved people figure into the narrative as the labor that powers the growth of the cotton economy and as commodities who are bought and sold. However, the large historiography on the economic lives of enslaved people and free Black people shows us that these folks were engaged as producers and consumers in the broader economy. Even in antebellum Virginia, even free Black people so have little power. They see their civil and political rights contracted during this time period. They dealt with violence and oppression. They saw their relatives abused and taken from them, but they also showed creativity and perseverance in navigating a society defined by white supremacy. So they built community and leaned into their own ideas and practices of freedom. They lent money and borrowed. If we want to fully understand how race factored into the development of the banking system, we have to also look at the credit practices of Black Americans. So in my forthcoming book, I rely on these three historiographies to offer a new perspective on the history of banking. So I want to see this building from a new perspective. So this is the Petersburg, Virginia branch of the Farmers Bank. It was built in 1817, which makes it one of the oldest bank buildings in the United States. And in this modern picture, we can see it's been beautifully restored. My research examines not what's happening inside of this building in 1817, but what doesn't happen in the building. What's happening all around the building outside in Petersburg. So instead of looking at archival sources associated with banking institutions, I looked for bank-like practices in the archive. So I looked for instances in which free Black or enslaved people borrowed or lent money. I used manuscript sources, published slave narratives, and legal sources. Instead of asking, how did an institution like this one change over time, I asked, how did these practices change over time? Who was involved in these practices? Why were people borrowing money? And what can these practices that often exist outside of the banking system tell us about the evolution of the banking system itself? So in part, these questions and methods come from my experience at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. And I promise we'll go back to the 19th century in just a minute. Before I returned to graduate school, I was part of the bank's community development and economic education work. Part of my job was to understand who is left out of the banking system and how do we bring those folks in. So for example, we looked at a phenomenon like payday lending. If you know anything about payday lending, you know that it's an incredibly exploitive system and it's aimed at the most vulnerable in the economy, recent immigrants, people of color, the working class, but it's also filling a need. So access to credit is foundational to wealth building and economic growth. At the Fed, we studied payday lending as a way to better understand the banking system. Payday lending taught us what financial needs existed among folks who aren't usually considered target clients for consumer banking. So we were able to work with community banks and credit unions to encourage them to offer products that served everyone in their communities. So to be clear, bank products will not solve the underlying and systemic issues that lead to a prevalence of practices like payday lending in our economy. But from that experience, I learned that examining practices outside of the constructed institutional frameworks that we have is a way to tell a broader story about the economy. So in my dissertation, I examined different forms of lending that I found in the archive. And I found that Black Virginians were active borrowers and lenders and fully integrated into local credit markets. That inclusion and integration did not come with political or civil rights. Instead, Black borrowers and lenders used that economic access to practice freedom for themselves and members of their communities as well as they could. I want to share one example with you today of a type of lending relationship that existed outside of the nascent banking system. And this is something that I'll describe in my upcoming book, Subscription Schemes. So subscription schemes were a popular means of assembling sums of capital, large and small, for many different types of projects. In a typical arrangement, subscribers signed on to each pledge a small portion toward a larger capital project. The promise of their collective future payments made a large investment feasible in a time when American banking and stock markets, as we know them today, were in infancy. So without modern banks and the corporate structure that we use today, people in communities who wanted to invest or build had to raise their own funding. Subscription schemes were one of the arrangements available. Subscribers, in part, funded the South Sea Company, infamous for its slave trading and one of the world's first financial crashes in 1720. Subscription schemes collected the capital in America to build canals, roads, and later railroads in the 19th century. The early publishing industry was largely funded through subscriptions. And the image you see here is the names of the subscribers printed in a 1749 book on the history of printing. So while subscription schemes bear some resemblance to charitable collections and were often used to raise money for the less fortunate, these financial arrangements departed from simple collections in one important aspect. Subscriptions were debt. In a typical arrangement, subscribers pledged future payments toward a shared financial goal. Subscribers agreed to become debtors in service of a capital project they wanted to support. This arrangement flipped the roles of debtor and creditor, with which we're familiar today. So in a typical modern arrangement, a creditor evaluates a potential debtor, the reason that they're going to borrow the money, their likelihood of paying it back. And if the creditor loans money to the debtor gets to enjoy the item they purchased with the money, but they forfeit it if they don't pay back the loan. In contrast, in a subscription scheme, a creditor or benefactor solicits pledges for future funding. So in this case, it was the benefactor's character or business acumen or the strength of the capital project proposed that attracts debtors. Another important aspect of subscription-based financial arrangements was their reliance on and connection to community. Modern debt arrangements center the individual who was legally responsible for paying back borrowed funds. If it is an individual's creditworthiness that's evaluated by a potential lender, and individuals lose financial value or sometimes their liberty if they don't abide by the contract terms. In contrast, a subscription scheme privileged the community. An individual debtor was someone who agreed to join a group or others in a shared collaborative goal. So building a railroad, supporting an indigent family, or manumitting someone from enslavement. The strength of the arrangement derived from the ability of the organizer to generate a list of subscribers who would collectively pay back their subscriptions. The risk was, if enough members of the group failed to pay, the entire scheme was in jeopardy. The upside of this community-based financial arrangement was that it spread risk among a large group of people. Instead of one person going into a significant amount of debt and taking on a high level of risk to publish a book or build a canal, a larger group of subscribers shared that risk and the rewards in the community. So by the 18th century, Black authors began to use the publishing industry's reliance on subscription funding to raise money for emancipatory strategies. So Olaudah Equiano, who many of you are familiar with, published his own account of his life by subscription, at once launching the literary genre of the slave narrative and the broader tradition of Black literature, as he brought awareness, global awareness, to the abolitionist cause. So while Equiano didn't use a subscription scheme to purchase his own freedom, this is something he'd already accomplished, I think what he does is even more powerful. He harnesses the financial power of subscription publishing in the service of the anti-slavery cause. In doing so, he paves the way for others in the Black and abolitionist communities to use subscriptions to accomplish more than the individual manumission of one person from enslavement. He ties the power of subscription financing to a host of abolitionist and Black freedom ventures. So Equiano, as you know, was born in 1745 in the Igbo region of the Kingdom of Benin, where he was kidnapped by slave traders as a child. During his enslavement, Equiano was forced to labor as a sailor, a profession he would continue in freedom. At about the age of 21, Equiano purchased his freedom, and by the end of the 1770s, he had settled in London and became involved in the growing British abolitionist movement. Equiano, known in England as Gustavus Vassa, penned the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa the African, in support of this cause. His goal was to acquaint English readers with the horrors of the slave trade and the practice of enslavement. Though Equiano did not publish his interesting narrative with the express goal of paying for the manumission of a specific person, publishing the book made him a celebrity and helped to broadly popularize the cause of abolition. Equiano self-published the interesting narrative in 1789 after compiling a list of subscribers, which was standard practice at the time. The success of the first edition led to 8 more editions published in Great Britain over the next 5 years, as well as translations into Dutch, German, and Russian, financed by hundreds of subscribers who Equiano had personally recruited. In Great Britain and in Europe, the interesting narrative found success in large part because of Equiano's skill in signing subscribers. Oh, and I have the list. This is the partial list of his subscribers, which included the Prince of Wales and the Duke of York, the first and second in line to the British throne. Members of the British nobility and prominent abolitionists added their names to this list. These subscribers not only provided the capital that Equiano used to publish multiple editions of his work, but they helped to popularize and lend credibility to the anti-slavery movement. Abolitionists in Great Britain, on the continent, and in America employed his interesting narrative to argue for Black freedom and forward their political goals even after the writer's death in 1797. Effectively, Equiano's hard work and ultimate success as an author and promoter marshaled a broad community around the anti-slavery cause. He parlayed a financial scheme into liberatory work, advancing a set of strategies that other members of the Black and abolitionist communities would employ. So by the early 19th century, especially in the upper US South, abolitionists increasingly championed subscription schemes as a strategy for manumitting individual enslaved people. And I've been able to document multiple examples in published accounts and manuscript sources. Here is an 1829 newspaper article announcing a subscription being raised for the family of Phil Lee. These arrangements often focused on a person or family in desperate circumstances, which Lee's family was. The beneficiary was usually someone who was about to be sold away from their family in the burgeoning domestic slave trade. For abolitionists, individual manumissions like this one were never envisioned as a threat to the system of slavery. And indeed, purchasing an individual's freedom perversely supported the argument that human beings could be bought and sold. Instead, abolitionists employed subscription schemes premised on the desperate plight of an enslaved person to rally support for the movement itself. Similar to many of the slave narratives collected and published by abolitionists, the goal was to shock sentimental readers with the sad plight of a worthy individual. The emotions brought forth from such a display might inspire readers to subscribe or otherwise contribute to the cause of abolition. Unfortunately for the beneficiaries, subscription schemes were not always successful in financing individual manumission. The second half of the narrative of Louisa Paquette provides an example. Paquette and her mother had been separated years earlier through sale to satisfy their owner's creditors. However, by 1859, Pequet was living free with her husband in Ohio when she received a letter from her mother in Texas, still enslaved and asking Pequet to purchase her freedom if she could. Her enslaver's price was high, $1,000, and Pequet had no money, but she considered her mother's freedom worth almost any price. Pequet and her husband first decided to take an advance on his next 2 years of pay from his employer. That loan gave the couple $500 toward the effort, according to her narrative. Then Pequet instituted what she called rigid economy in her home, which only brought another $60 in savings. Finally, she turned to a subscription to raise the remaining funds. In March of 1860, local church pastors placed notices in the Daily Gazette and the Journal and Messenger of Cincinnati to attest that Pequet was, quote, worthy of public sympathy and benevolence, which is where the title of my talk comes from. These notices she pasted into a subscription book and started collecting funds to free her mother. Some were outright donations, but most of the money that Pequet raised was in the form of subscriptions. So she collected subscriptions from her husband's employer, people she met when she went village to village, men and women she met in churches where she most likely shared her story and offered the endorsements written by pastors. Subscription amounts ranged from 95 cents up to $50, but she wrote that most were around $5 each. Pequet traveled from Cincinnati to Oberlin, Ohio, Buffalo, and New York City. She appealed to anti-slavery advocates and Christian churches known for their anti-slavery stance. After 2 months of work, Pequet had cash and subscriptions amounting to within $100 of the total. However, when she began to collect on the subscriptions that had been written, some of the subscribers had died, some had moved away, and others just were no longer interested in paying. So this inability to collect on the subscriptions left Pequet, as she said, almost in despair, and highlights the extent to which subscription schemes were really a form of debt. From the perspective of the subscriber, subscriptions represented a future promise to pay. For multiple reasons, subscribers chose to sign their name in Pequet's subscription book, promising their future earnings. Like other forms of debt, subscriptions created a financial relationship shaped by decisions about creditworthiness. Even though Pequet was not the debtor in this relationship, she had to portray herself and her cause as worthy of the future earnings of her subscribers. Subscribers themselves took on the role of debtor when they judged the plight of Pequet and her mother, and when they trusted that their future payments would manumit a woman who was deserving of freedom. However, like other debtors, they defaulted due to a range of personal and systemic economic situations. These defaults left Pequet in a precarious situation. Ultimately, she was not able to raise the funds she needed to manumit her mother with a subscription scheme. But she did free her. Pequet raised the last of the cash she needed through the sale of her narrative, which I should say too, Phil Lee was able to raise the money to free his children. The last example I gave you. So those subscription schemes used to purchase and manumit enslaved people did not themselves lead to general emancipation. Black communities were able to harness these financial arrangements for other emancipatory strategies. So freedom for these communities was not just the absence of enslavement. Freedom also meant the constitution of community, or the reconstitution of community. It meant being able to care for and direct the education of children in the community. It meant to be able to live without the threat of violence. Members of the First African Baptist Church in Richmond, Virginia, used a subscription scheme to pursue this vision of freedom. So this is an image from 1865 of the first building that was home to First African Baptist Church. So First African Baptist Church started as part of First Baptist Church. First Baptist Church was established in Richmond in 1780 and welcomed a multiracial congregation. However, by 1841, white members of the church were uneasy with the growing Black proportion of its membership. By that point, white Southern evangelicals were overwhelmingly pro-slavery. Black congregants chafed in a spiritual environment that was increasingly anti-Black. So in 1941, the white members voted to allow the Black members to break off and form their own congregation. The Black members viewed the split as an opportunity to distance themselves from the racism they had experienced at First Baptist. They formed First African Baptist Church and purchased the former First Baptist Church building from the white congregants, who went down the street and built their own new church building. First Baptist entered into a loan agreement with First African Baptist to allow the congregation to purchase the buildings outright. Ostensibly, they said out of love for them and from pure regard to their spiritual interests. However, Henry Box Brown had a different take on the loan between First Baptist and First African Baptist. So Brown, who is known for his escape from enslavement in Richmond by mailing himself in a box to freedom in the North, was a member of First Baptist Church before the split. In his narrative, Brown described the loan as a pious fraud meant to prevent members of First African from purchasing freedom for enslaved people associated with the church. Brown writes that when a splendid new church was built for the whites, the old building was offered to First African for $3,000, a great deal below its market value of $13,000, or its assessed value of $13,000. Brown wrote that it was understandable that members of First African would want to take advantage of the deal and have a building where they could meet and worship on their own terms. But this deal was meant to extort. Brown wrote, quote, "The Negroes paid what was at first demanded of them for the old building, but when they wished to get it placed entirely in their hands, they were charged with a still further sum. And after they had paid that, they had still more to pay." So Brown's recounting of the story squares with the surviving minutes from the church's business meetings at the time. First African went to the state attorney general for advice on its dealings with First Baptist when they weren't able to get the building transferred into their name. They were told to appoint a white board of trustees to handle the transaction. And they also, by the way, were required to call a white pastor. So leadership of First African Baptist and First Baptist met in 1848. This is 7 years after they split, and finally agreed that the Black congregation would pay another $500 and that would settle the matter. The members of the congregation of First Baptist Church had paid the loan securing the church building for their use, but at a much higher rate than they had originally agreed. So despite these initial setbacks, First African Baptist Church continued to grow and undertake its missionary and evangelical activities. It added members from among the free and enslaved African-American population in the city. Congregants sponsored missionaries to Africa and migrants to Liberia. They made gifts to the poor and occasionally were able to purchase the freedom of enslaved people among their membership. By the mid-1850s, the church was planning a daughter church to the west. This time, First African Baptist Church would plant a church without going into debt to First Baptist Church. In 1856, the church authorized the pastor to purchase a 60-foot lot on Lee Street in Richmond for a new house of worship. To raise the $541.25 to repay the pastor for the purchase, the church leadership voted to take up a collection on Christmas Day, and they would continue this collection until the amount was paid in full. Then, after they paid off the land, in 1857, First African Baptist, quote, appointed 12 brethren and furnished them with books to get subscriptions to build the church on Lee Street. Sisters were also appointed for the same purpose. So they selected 24 folks out of the congregation to lead this subscription drive. Congregants moved quickly, and the new church was dedicated the following year. So the resulting church, it was Third African Baptist Church. Now it's Ebenezer Baptist Church in Richmond, continues to serve as a center of worship for parishioners in the Jackson Ward community in Richmond. First African's larger purpose in raising the subscription was ultimately not the building, but what it symbolized and what could be accomplished with it. First African and other Black Baptist churches, the other Black Baptist churches they planted in Richmond, became foundational to the Black community in the city. Before emancipation, they purchased individuals from enslavement. They also adjudicated between members of the community to ensure that Black Richmonders received justice and fair treatment, something they did not often get from the city or the Commonwealth. They established mutual aid societies and gave money to benefit the poor. First African Baptist taught its members to read, even when it was illegal in Virginia to teach Black people literacy. So the church, in addition, the church gave members who moved out of the area letters of dismissal. These could be used to gain membership at other Baptist churches. These letters paved the way for its members to move to freer communities in the North and connected them. The church nurtured Black leaders before and after emancipation. I do have another picture. This is a drawing from the 1870s of the inside of First African Baptist Church. So Maggie Walker, who was the first Black woman to open a bank, was a longtime member of the church and part of their community work. So my point is that communities require infrastructure to do their work, and that infrastructure often requires a large capital expense. When they didn't have access to banks, First African Baptist Church made use of a subscription scheme to erect a building that would allow them to practice freedom in their community. It's an example of the ways in which Black communities financed freedom in the 19th century. And it's one of the stories that I'll tell in my forthcoming book. So I'll stop there. Thank you everyone for your time, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Amanda. You could pull down the picture perhaps, and then I think Daniel, then, yeah, there we are.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Please send your questions in, folks. I have several of my own, but we want the audience typing away. Amanda, first of all, many things came to mind listening to your presentation for me. We've always said that, not only was there all kinds of slave resistance in many forms, cultural forms, religious forms, etc. But this type of resistance, I'm not sure we've ever talked much about. And therein lies a lot of the originality of your work. What you're showing is, whether it's enslaved people on the ground in the South, or for that matter, abolitionist communities, in the case of Equiano in Britain, and then here in the American abolition movement, we've always talked about mobilization being one of the great achievements of abolitionism. But this is a type of mobilization too, isn't it? It's mobilization on the ground by enslaved people and mobilization by abolitionist allies on their behalf. It's amazing, using this, let's just call it this capitalist system, which can't function without credit, capital, debt, and money. So talk a little more about that. I mean, this is, and I know you have many other examples, this is a form of mobilization by the enslaved and their allies.
Right. I mean, this is a capitalist system, and it's a capitalist system that assigns value to individual people. And so, of course, those communities are going to take that opportunity to if freedom can be bought and sold, if freedom can be sold, it can be purchased. And so that provides an opportunity for them to purchase that freedom. But like you said, that requires capital. Again, this is also an economy that's mostly run on credit for, during this time period. And so it's about what are the different ways that we can assemble credit and, to get to assemble this amount of money needed to purchase freedom. I mean, I'll say too, this is also a legal system. And so even, Frederick Douglass, who sits behind you here, I see, even though Frederick Douglass, as a fugitive, was able to practice freedom, I mean, he was not able to legally be free until money was collected to purchase his freedom. So it's part of the system. Yeah.
It took fundraisers in Britain to do it, to raise the money to buy his freedom. And he's hardly alone in that.
Right.
I'm getting questions in now. I have others of my own. Let me ask one other one here before someone else does. And a different path here. I know you worked for several years for the Federal Reserve. Now, and I know you have a degree in economics as well as history. That's an unusual route for most historians. And it seems incredibly valuable in your own instincts and your own research. Could you reflect a little bit on that experience of working for the Federal Reserve in that division you worked?
Yeah.
That led you to these subjects when you were doing a PhD?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, most economic historians are econometricians and they work with a lot of data, and that's not at all my background. I mean, I've had a little bit of statistics and econometrics, but really what I bring to history is an understanding of how banks work and the importance of banks in the economy, and how they're used and how they change over time. And
Mhm.
so that's really what I bring to history is, that's what allows me to say, okay, what sort of looks like a bank but isn't a bank,
Yeah,
and how what are the different forms of credit operating in the economy, in this developing capitalistic economy. What are those other forms of debt? It's also, I mean, part of my experience at the Federal Reserve is in personal finance, and in a lot of ways, this is sort of personal finance. This is not about how big businesses grow. This is not about how large amounts of capital are moved around the economy. This is how individuals sort of move in this system, and how do people fit into their communities? How do they individually get the cash that they need to operate?
yeah. And I think you used the term early in your talk about the nascent banking system. Indeed,
Yeah,
Americans were, for decades and decades in the early republic up to the Civil War, Americans were constantly trying to create banks, but uh, confidence in banks, the very existence of banks took forever. It has its own history, of course.
right.
And a real banking system takes decades and decades to really evolve. You couldn't just walk down the street and get a loan from a bank. So you got to have some other alternative.
Right.
There's a question here, interesting, from Catherine Doherty. Have you found example? I mean, your example of First African Baptist is, of course, in Richmond, a city. Certain things may have been possible in urban settings, even within slavery. What about rural areas? Find any examples of like a rural church that might have tried to do this? Or, I mean, that's probably more elusive, but
Right.
any,
Yeah, I mean, so one of the questions in my research is, what are the connections between the city and the country, and is there this big divide, and how does that work? And I have found examples of people who use subscription schemes and other forms of debt. Subscription schemes is one of the sort of forms of debt that I documented in my dissertation. And what I find is that it depends on networks. And so there are often people who are living out in a rural community. Their enslavers are connected to abolitionist communities in the North through the Colonization Society. That's one of the connections.
yeah, especially in the Upper South. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. So a lot of these connections are through enslaver networks, that they are able. But because part of this is about relationships that they have been able to negotiate in the world that they live. But I even document credit relationships on a much even smaller level. People are borrowing from each other to help provide for their families every day. So it may not even be money that exchanges hands, but people are lending like chickens and skilled labor and things among each other, so that they can provide for their families a little bit better than they have.
I can't pay you money, but I can come do this service for you, or I can do
Right.
that for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. So I actually found a will of an enslaved man, which it's the only will of an enslaved person I've found, in, I think, Shenandoah County. And in the will, he writes about who owes him what. And pay those folks all, and it's very small debts. This person owes me $2 or whatever. But he makes account of that so that he can settle that at his passing.
He wasn't going to go to his maker without laying down who owed him.
That's right. Well, and to make sure that his children got the things that he
Wow.
owned, you know.
That's fascinating, even if it's small amounts of money.
Right. But
And
it's, you know, connecting a community.
and you might comment more. You mentioned that this is about relationships. I remember you telling me in a different conversation that often this had to do with relationships that enslaved folks had made with slaveholders. I mean,
Right.
you know, these are people they know. And I wondered there too, your example of Piquet, do I pronounce that right? And
Actually don't know.
Piquet,
Yeah.
or any other example like that, when someone knows a loved one or someone is going to be sold, the
Yeah.
timing of these things had to be crucial. And
Yeah.
this must have, I mean, this is not a fast moving society like ours. People must have been desperate. You know, I got to have $500. I got to start with 200. I got to have money. And in her case, she said that owner wanted $1,000.
Yeah.
So that the sheer desperation and urgency of these things just to hold on to somebody or survive meant getting money.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, most of these connections are about survival. I mean, it's saving someone who's about to get sold away from you, but it's also, you know, I've documented store accounts that enslaved people had, and it's so that they could provide enough food for their children, because enslavers, you know, were notorious about providing just enough, you know.
Yeah.
And or, you know, warmer clothing and these sorts of things. So it really was about survival.
Yeah. Wow. There's a question here from Caleb Knapp. Admires your talk, calls it truly fantastic. Struck by your two examples there of Equiano and Piquet, or Piquet, maybe, I don't know.
Maybe.
Wondering whether gender shaped the success or failure of some of these things. Was there more, I don't know, sympathy perhaps for women, or no? Any pattern there about gender, and when people are particularly raising money to try to save individuals?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Many of the examples I found were women. And so I don't know if I think if you're writing a slave narrative and you want to appeal to sentimental readers, being a woman is one way to do that. You know, we know that enslaved narrative, there's so much enslaved narratives about women's honor and how slavery dishonored Black women sexually. So I think that is part of it. You know, and I mean, I think that's interesting too, because when we think about gender sort of in the broader banking system, we think of women having less access to credit through the banking system. I mean, especially in the antebellum period, this is a business for white men, by white men.
Often not even having the right.
Right, exactly. So I have looked at at the Hagley in Wilmington has some really interesting sources for the Wilmington Savings Fund Society. And in those records, I was surprised to see a number of women had accounts that they had savings accounts. They weren't necessarily borrowing. So, you know, so that's, but by and large, the banking system is not for women. But these credit networks that are more relational and more based on sort of how an individual builds their network, who they appeal to.
Right.
It's interesting. Like in some ways, it does create more opportunity for women.
It's amazing.
Which is it's kind of a weird kind of thing, you know.
Well, so you actually have found bank accounts held by enslaved people.
There are a handful, yes. And this is
the fact that they even exist is extraordinary.
Yeah, just a handful. And I'm not sure that and those accounts are often in the name of someone, sometimes in the name of someone else, so Elizabeth Keckley, who also
Right.
is known for writing her narrative. So when she
Worked at the
borrowed,
White House for Mrs. Lincoln.
yes, yes. When she purchases her freedom and that of her son, she borrows money from the wealthy white women in her network. And she, as she gathers these small sums of money until she gets enough, she deposits them at a bank. But this is part of I need to do more research on this piece before I write this chapter, because it's not clear to me if they're deposited in her name or if they're in her lawyer's name, her, white male lawyer.
Yeah.
So I have just sort of a handful of examples of this.
There are a couple of questions here. They're asking you to reflect on modern, well, I don't know if you call them modern derivatives of this. One question asks about GoFundMe schemes today. Is there some comparison there? Another about everything from rent parties to other kinds of community organizing of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Maybe there is a root. I mean, I'm not asking you to draw a straight line.
Yeah.
But maybe there is a root here about how, well, that's for you to say, how about how marginalized people, essentially defined out of the economy, nevertheless find some way into it.
Right. And and there's
doing it.
There's a significant economics literature around modern savings fund societies among like Korean women. Like there are a few societies where this is a practice, where a group of often women will get together, and everyone, it almost acts more like the benevolent societies of the 19th century. But I think there are similarities with GoFundMe. I mean, the difference there is that GoFundMe really is just you're giving money, and whatever you give, that person gets. And subscription schemes are really a debt arrangement. I mean, I would say the sort of more modern equivalent with subscription schemes might be like your Netflix subscription, because you've got to pay, you sign up and you've got to pay it every month, and that's sort of how these worked. But in terms of bringing a community together, and bringing a community together around a project that's seen to benefit the community in a broader way, GoFundMe might be a good example.
This reflects one of those questions here by Adi Van Dyke. The risk in this, it seems, is this could go on so long, you just lose your debtors. Right?
Yeah, right.
You pointed this out in the case of the woman in Ohio, right?
Yeah.
People might die, people move away, people lose interest, they don't come through for you. I mean, that's true of anything that's a subscription, including, our newspaper subscriptions. Well, those of us who have newspaper subscriptions. People might not pay up for you. I mean, you're always dependent here on goodwill, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Which in the publishing industry in the 19th century, this is a big problem. People, you have canvassers who go around and sign subscriptions, and then people don't pay them.
Well, Frederick Douglass always ran a column that I think was the back page of his newspaper for all those 16 years, listing the names of those who haven't paid up, and he would embarrass them any way he could. It didn't necessarily actually work. Another comment here by Annie Harper. You got a lot of people thinking about the present with this.
Yeah.
Annie Harper says that the social networking, particularly of women today, and women of color in particular, is full of this kind of thing. Schemes to raise money, schemes to raise support money, and so on. And so it's interesting that a root of this isn't just early 20th century women's groups. It isn't modernism or urbanism. It's actually even on the ground.
Yeah, it's very community level.
In antebellum America.
Yes. And I mean, this is also, when we look at in some ways, this project started with Maggie Walker, who was, I mean, she's very well known. So I live in Richmond when I'm not here in New Haven, and she's very prominent in the community. When I was at the Federal Reserve, we had a bookmark that celebrated her, and she is really coming out of that women's benevolent tradition. And so when she starts her bank, the goal is not let's build a bank and, make as much profit as we can. And how do we use this capital? It really is about how do we enrich the community? How do we lift the community up?
Is she the first Black millionaire, or do we really know?
No, she's not the first black or even the first Black woman millionaire.
Oh, okay. Well, I think sometimes she's been called that, whether she was.
Probably so.
Yeah. That kind of entrepreneurial capitalism began with a community root. Another person writes in here, Prescott Harris, comparing this to all kinds of mutual aid societies in the Black community, Masonic lodges, and so on. Again, you're showing here the roots of something. But I want to take you back a little bit here to this is a study of slavery.
Right.
And some elements, some layers, some meanings of slavery. And we don't tend to think in these terms very much. What do you want your book to ultimately do here about this system? What do you want your book your research to ultimately tell us about this system? Is it the story of how under oppression, nevertheless, human ingenuity thrives, or is it much, much better than that?
That's a great question that I need to think a lot about. But I think that, I mentioned last week to you, I think that I've been doing a really close read of Jennifer Morgan's work, and her whole point about how enslavement is the severing of kinship ties and the severing of community. And so for me, it's about how community is reconstituted, and not specifically financially, but sort of through this financial necessity. It's another way to lean into your community. So I guess I sort of see it as about community at the end of the day. Community as the opposite of enslavement.
Yeah, and building survival mechanisms and so forth.
And envisioning a world beyond enslavement.
Right. Through not just commerce.
Right.
They're not all trying to create a business and sell something.
Exactly.
They are trying to protect themselves, provide mutual aid, to create some kind of security.
Mm-hmm.
I can't help asking a silly, perverse question too. I know you're going to call your book "Credit Is Due," and that's a cool title. It really is. I don't know.
I'm still working on it.
Well, I thought of another title, and titles are fun.
Yeah.
But as long as you don't have to be responsible for them. But what about enslaved capitalists?
I think that's out there somewhere.
Has it already been used? Okay.
Yeah. It's sort
all
of
the capitalism studies going on. I just thought that might be worth trying.
Right. It also gets to what is a capitalist? What is capitalism? Is everybody in the economy a capitalist who borrows? I'm not sure that they are. So it's a good idea, though. Thank you.
You no doubt already have been or will be challenged in some way, as people always have been when they write about forms of community resistance.
Yeah.
I don't know if you even have a sense of this yet, but how many? You don't have any numbers, I know that, but what scale does this take on? Your sense of this, what kind of scale does this take on? People who did survive slavery, how many of them, roughly, would you say, experienced this phenomenon?
Yeah. Among the number of people who were able to free themselves is very small. That's a very small number. But the number of people who had some connection through community, through You
Mhm.
know, when we look at the slaves economy, I mean, this is an economy that's often not working on cash. It's a credit economy. And even though
Right,
it's most people are just dealing in very small amounts, it
right.
also includes a lot of people, especially in the upper South, where you know, these communities have been established for a long time.
Yeah,
So so I would say a lot of people have some connection to credit networks.
right. Well, and you're also, I love the fact that you started with, I mean, as a historian, you started with that historiographical survey by even showing covers of books, because you are part of a now long tradition, but with your own unique um, point of view on this, that forms of coping, survival, resistance, and so on, were always there. That was one of the great insights of the explosion of slavery scholarship in the 1960s and 70s, even into the 80s. But that work tended to focus on culture. Again, music, religion, folklore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Your focus on economics, uh, that was there in the older literature too. I mean, there've been books like Larry Hudson's book on Liberty County, Georgia, which showed that enslaved people who testified to the Freedmen's Claims Commission had a real sense of property ownership. They owned tools, they owned livestock, and they wanted to complain that that damn Union Army had stolen their hogs and stolen this and that. So a sense of property, a sense of ownership was there. But you're showing there's even a sense here of access to some kind of world of nascent, if not banking,
Right.
at least fundraising.
Right, exactly. Yeah, of course. Because I mean, they have to do this to survive, you know. And so it's not surprising then in 1865 when you know, we get general emancipation, like people know how to create their communities. It's not
Yeah.
surprising, you know, because they practiced this.
Well, it's also, isn't it? It might even be something out of a James Scott theory about weapons that weaker, poorer people use. I mean,
Yeah.
this is seeing how this economy functions, knowing, if I'm interpreting you right, knowing that you're going to have to develop a relationship with this man who's your owner, and his and these other masters in the community. You got to live with these people, but you got to learn how to manipulate them too, and you may be able to find a way to get some money out of them or
Yeah.
some credit out of them.
Right. Right. And if it wasn't your own, the person who enslaved you, it was the person down the street,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know.
Have you been invited by the Federal Reserve actually to come back and talk about this? Do they want to know some history there?
I haven't yet. I'm not sure that they'll have me back. I may not be close. For me, this is about the banking, understanding what's happening in the banking system outside the banking system. It
Yeah.
might be too far from the banking system for them to care. I don't know. Maybe when the book comes out.
It's too alternative banking for the
Yeah.
Federal Reserve, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we worked ourselves through most of the questions. We still have a wonderful audience out here. Um, Maybe reflect a little more, if you would, Amanda. Just one last question here. Um, when you finish this book, and I forget which chapter you're revising now, when you finish this and you put it out, um, what do you want its overall point to be? What do you want its thrust to be within this crazy broad world of slavery studies?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I want people to understand that the banking system as we experience it today has been constructed over hundreds of years. You know, that the way that we do banking, the way that we do finance today is the result of centuries of power structures and changes and these kind of things. But you know, I mean, I also want to contribute to this idea that African Americans are part of this long history of
Mhm.
financial success and financial work, and that that this sort of, when we think about the racial wealth gap, that it's not just a product of the last couple of years. I mean, we had Black millionaires in the 19th century, that these these financial arrangements and things put in place to benefit the Black community. The Black community has done this over and over and over, and so for me, that's a community that has thrived and is able to thrive if we are able to, I don't want to say eliminate racism in the system, although that would be great. But without sort of like racialized power structures and things. I mean, this is a community that does fantastic things.
Yeah, I'm so glad you put it that way, because we are always talking about the legacies of slavery. I mean, we are here at the GLC. We have a whole project. We have a 4-year project going on legacies of slavery. We're doing it with small colleges, and the wealth gap, economic disparity, health disparity, et cetera, et cetera. Right. These are all part of that project. But your study actually, I think, has something to say. You don't want to be too instrumental about it. You can't say, read my book and you'll understand everything about economic inequality. Exactly. But this shows how old this question is, and how the pushback, fighting against it, the fighting with it, right, is just as old as the first idea of a bank. Right. And most enslaved people did not benefit from a subscription scheme, right, I suspect. Yes. But those who did left this counter legacy almost. Yeah. I'm not writing your conclusion now here.
Yeah. That's good though. You're welcome to do so.
I'm just trying to figure out how we can use this book in that legacies project. So so we're all rooting for you here. Well, anyway, let's see. Oh God, there's yet another question about Madam C.J. Walker. Well, it's more about who's the first millionaire and all that. You don't, right. That's not your responsibility to figure that one out.
A little after my time.
A little after your time is right. And there were some very wealthy Black men I know who, in fact, Shane White, great scholar of African American history in Australia, wrote a book about, I think, the first New York Black millionaire who created the numbers business.
Yeah.
But that was in the late 19th, early 20th century. That wasn't a banking scheme or a subscription scheme, but it was a scheme.
It is, yes.
Anyway, well, Amanda, thank you. This has been a great session. And I think you gave everybody a whole new thing to think about. It's been delightful to have you here and continue to be the rest of this semester. Right. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks. And thank you to everybody who